In our last lecture, we were introduced to the trickster figure in world mythology, and our extended illustration was a trickster cycle from the Winnebago people of Wisconsin. We ended that lecture by talking about some theories to account for the character's popularity and pervasiveness in all kinds of cultures around the world. This time we want to broaden our discussion a little bit by considering 4 tricksters from 4 different parts of the world. Hermes from Greece, Enki from Sumer, Loki from Norse mythology, and Maui from Oceania. We'll see if we can get a little closer in looking at these 4 to understanding the appeal and importance of this world figure. We'll start with Hermes. Hermes wears a lot of hats in Greek mythology. He's, as we mentioned last time, he's the guardian of doorways. He occupies that ambiguous position between inside and out, here and there, us and them. He's also the god of luck, of finding something that might change one's life. He's the god of the unexpected windfall, like finding $1,000 laying on the sidewalk. But he's also the patron of thieves, and the god of travelers, and the god of the road itself. And in these cases, nobody cares about your letters of safe passage, so that he might just as easily cause a catastrophic loss as a windfall. He's also a messenger of the gods, especially for Zeus, and he's also what is in classical mythology is called a psychopomp. That is, he's a transporter of souls. Usually he takes souls from here to Hades, as he does at the end of Homer's Odyssey, but sometimes he manages to bring souls back from Hades, as he does when he brings Persephone back, as we remember from Lecture 27. He's also the god of the marketplace, which makes him the god of the patron of both fair exchanges and the not so fair exchanges. And he's even the god of communication and language, which sometimes communicates truth and sometimes communicates lies and deceits. He's a trickster not just for these reasons, but because of the way that he worms his way in to the Greek pantheon. He is the son of Zeus and Maya, who is a daughter of a Titan, so he's fully divine. That is, both of his parents are gods. But Zeus has no plans to incorporate him into the pantheon. In fact, he was conceived in a cave so that Zeus could stay away from the prying eyes of Hera, his wife. And Zeus seems to have planned just to keep Hermes in the cave, and that's that, and he has no further plans for him. But when he's one day old, Hermes leaves the cave, and the first thing he comes across outside the cave is a tortoise. This is one of those windfalls that he would later on be responsible for. He tells the tortoise, "Oh, you're not safe out here. Come on inside and I'll take care of you." And as soon as the tortoise is inside his cave, he kills him and then takes his shell and stretches leather across it and uses sheep gut and makes the first lyre. He uses the sheep gut for strings and makes the first lyre. That first day, he steals Apollo's cattle, and to make it harder for Apollo to track them, he actually drives the cattle backwards so that the tracks look like they're going in the opposite direction from where he's actually taking them. When Apollo finally catches up with Hermes, he hauls him before Zeus for judgment. Hermes just flat out denies everything, and Zeus is just really charmed with the sheer effrontery of this baby who has been caught dead to rights, but who denies doing anything at all. Zeus makes Hermes give the cattle back to Apollo, at least what's left of them, because Hermes had already sacrificed 2 of them to the 12 Olympian gods. And Apollo says, "I beg your pardon, there are only 11 Olympian gods." And Hermes says, "At your service, sir." Meanwhile, he charms Apollo with a song from his lyre, and Apollo is so taken with the lyre that the lyre forever after becomes Apollo's special instrument. Apollo forgives him the theft of the herd of the cattle in exchange for the lyre, and Zeus brings Hermes into the pantheon, giving him a host of responsibilities, some of which we've just mentioned. The trickster qualities of Hermes in this story are clear in the way that he actually tricks his way into the pantheon. And he does what, as we mentioned last time, what tricksters always do. He brings something from outside into a stable culture. Here, he becomes that part of the culture, the part of that culture himself. He is what he brings in from outside. He brings himself into the pantheon, and when he does, he changes it forever. And this is what tricksters always do. Since they live on the edges between categories, they're always sliding back and forth between here and there, between inside and outside, bringing in something that a culture had thrown away, And once inside, the culture has to change to absorb the new element. We'll get back to this idea later in the lecture and later in the unit. Our second trickster is Enki from Sumeria. We've already run across him as Ea in the Babylonian myths that we looked at earlier. He's not quite as slippery as Hermes, but he does one thing that brings him into the club. We remember this from lectures 4 and 9. He was the god of sweet waters and the god of wisdom, and he's a culture hero because one of the things he does is he brings the gifts of civilization to humans. He earns his trickster stripes by his part in the flood story that we looked at back in lecture 9. Enlil, remember, makes all the gods take oaths that they won't tell humans that the flood is coming. And so what Ea does, the way he gets around that oath, is that he tells that the flood is coming not directly to a human, but to Utnapishtim's house, the walls of his house. And then the walls tell Utnapishtim, so that the humans get warned and the humans get saved from the flood anyway. The gods, after they discover that some humans have actually survived the flood, are initially angry. But remember that Ea reminds them that humans were created to do the work the gods didn't want to do themselves, and hence it's good to have some of them around. So like all tricksters, Enki too lives on the edge. Here he lives on the edge between gods and humans. And like all tricksters, he moves those boundaries by telling humans about the counsels of the gods, confusing the categories just enough to save humankind. So like all tricksters, he is a culture hero and a trickster simultaneously. That just barely gets Enki into the club, because otherwise he's far too much part of the Sumerian establishment to be much like other tricksters. Usually tricksters are loners or outsiders and are far more subversive than Enki is here. Loki, from Norse mythology, on the other hand, is a full-blooded trickster. We've already had some glimpses of him in earlier lectures, but just to remind ourselves of who he is. In Snorri's The Prose Edda, once Loki is captured by a giant, the giant will free Loki only if Loki will bring Idun, who's the goddess who tends the orchard where the apples of immortality grow. Those are the apples that keep the gods and goddesses young. Loki tricks Idun, who brings some of her apples, into coming with him and then turns her over to the giants. Once she's gone, the gods start growing old and gray, and they confront Loki, who then does a reverse trick. He changes himself into a falcon, and then he steals Idun back from Giant Land and brings her back to Asgard. Once she's back, the damage is pretty much undone and things go back to where they were. What Loki does here is simply cause a tiny bit of remediable mischief. But the story is a perfect illustration of what tricksters do. The gods have built Asgard with a huge wall around it. Outside the wall are the giants, who are always their enemies, their own private garbage heap, which they want to keep out there. Loki is like all trickster figures. He's a liminal figure living between two worlds. He's part of the pantheon at Asgard, but his father was a giant, and he fathers his own children by a giantess. So he lives between worlds. He lives in both worlds, like a Herm in a doorway. What he does in this story is to move that wall between worlds by introducing the giants to the apples of immortality while bringing into Asgard time and aging. Outside the walls, the giants might very well ask why they can't eat those apples. Loki moves the boundaries so that they can, and he confuses the two worlds and in the process shakes both of them up. In this case, nothing really changes. When a giant chases Loki back to Asgard, when Loki has kidnapped Idun and her apples, the gods kill the giant on the wall and the borders go back to exactly the way they were before any of this happened. The gods in the future will probably keep a closer eye on Loki, but nothing has changed otherwise. What's inside is still inside, what's outside is still outside. Safely so, from the gods' point of view. But there's another Loki story that has different consequences, much more serious than this one. This is the myth that we looked at back in lecture 11 concerning Balder, who's the son of Odin and his wife Frigg, and he is also the fairest and the most beautiful of the gods. This part of the story begins when Balder starts having bad dreams, and his mother Frigg, worried about what those dreams might portend, decides to protect him from whatever is on the way. And so she goes through the world and elicits from every single thing, animal, vegetable, mineral, every single thing in the world, a promise that it will not harm Balder. After she's finished, we talked about this in an earlier lecture, but after she's finished, the gods at parties, at their raucous parties, spend a lot of time just throwing things at Balder, knowing that nothing can hurt him anyway, that he's impervious because his mother has gotten this promise from everything. But Loki is irritated by all of this, and so he disguises himself and has a long, intimate conversation with Frigg, in which he gets her to admit that she did not elicit a promise from the mistletoe, which he thought was too young, too innocent to do any damage. So that was the one thing that she didn't get a promise from. So at the next party, Loki gets Hoder, the blind god, to throw a mistletoe spear at Balder, and of course it kills him. Loki also then makes sure, as we remember from that story, that he stays dead. When Odin sends another of his sons down into Hell to try to retrieve Balder, Hel, the goddess of the underworld, says he can come back only if every single thing in the universe will weep for him. And everything does, even the rocks and trees, we are told, weep the way everything weeps after a frost and a thaw after a frost. The one creature who doesn't mourn is a giantess in a cave. She says, I don't know what Balder's ever done for me, and so I have no intention of mourning for him. Later on, it was understood that that giantess was another one of Loki's disguises. That was Loki. And the gods are now absolutely furious with Loki, who both got Balder killed and then make sure that he stays dead. So the gods hunt him down. And there's a long plot about all the tricky shape-shifting that Loki goes through, but the gods eventually catch him. When they catch him, they bind him underneath the earth. They tie him down with the entrails of one of his own children, and then they set a snake to drip venom on his face for all eternity. The trickster, it would seem, has been forever banished from the organized world of the gods. But we remember from Lecture 11 again that this isn't the end of the story. After the binding of Loki comes a prophecy to the gods about Ragnarok, the end of the world. And we remember those prophecies. Terrible winters will follow each other with no summers in between. Brothers will kill each other. The wolf that every day chases the sun across the sky will catch and eat it. The stars will vanish. And the bonds holding Loki will then be broken so that he can lead the final assault against the gods. And after all the gods and monsters have killed each other, the universe will be destroyed by fire. Out of this flaming apocalypse, a new world may be created, peopled by a pair of humans that survived. The daughter of the sun will take her mother's place in the sky, and the gods or their descendants will reappear, and at that point, Balder may return. There are several interesting points about this story. Lewis Hyde in Trickster Makes This World says that the oath dragged out of everything by Frigg to make sure her son is protected is an effort to protect the existing order so completely that nothing can ever change again. That is, trying to make Asgard so safe that nothing bad will ever happen. Hyde argues that if this were to happen in any society, whether a society of gods or humans or demons or angels, if this were ever to happen, society would simply ossify. It would simply collapse into a sterile stasis. It would die because we remember from our creation myths that without any change or disruption, we have no friction from two sticks rubbed together, and so any organism, whatever it is, will wither and die under those circumstances. To say it another way, if we could control our environment so thoroughly that nothing could ever surprise us, would we still be alive? Is life with no surprises, no risks, no chance, a life at all? Hyde says that the central motivation of this whole story is the effort made by the gods to keep anything from changing again. Had Frigg succeeded, chance could never have entered the walls of Asgard again. Loki, as a trickster figure, is annoyed by this effort, and he moves to disrupt it. The point is that whenever any system, whether it's political or social or economic or religious, becomes so rigid that it allows for no garbage to be brought in from outside, it goes up in flames, as it does in this myth. Societies who are prepared to allow within the walls some garbage from outside fare better. since they can incorporate some of the dirt the trickster always brings with him. By trying to eliminate change and by trying to tying up the trickster underground, Asgard in a way creates its own doom. We don't know what the new creation, assuming there is one, will be like, but we can only hope that it will incorporate into itself some dirt left outside in the last order. If it does, it will be more vibrant, more active, more energetic, in living ways that the trickster advocates and represents in all of his myths. Our final trickster for our example today is from Oceania. Oceania are those thousands of South Pacific islands between Asia and South America. The people who live on them seem to have come from a common place. They traveled across open seas in small boats. They established communities from Hawaii to New Zealand, from Easter Island to Indonesia. And they all have a common cultural heritage, which is reflected in their myths, which of course by now have been deflected off in individual cultural ways, but they still share a great many elements and motifs. One of their trickster figures is a character named Maui, who's portrayed in myths as human, not as an animal, and who is Oceania's greatest culture hero, as well as a great trickster figure who manages to violate almost every important taboo of all of the people who live in these thousands of islands. The myth that we'll look at here is a kind of composite one. It's drawn from several sources. As a culture hero, Maui is created with 7 great feats, all of which create circumstances in which people still live to this day. Again, as with always with tricksters, all of them are achieved less from a desire to help people than an impulse to act out his own nature, to be himself, to do whatever he does. Maui looks a little bit, in his early story, looks a bit like the heroes we looked at in the last unit. He was born as a 5th son to a mother who thinks she can't feed him, so she throws him into the sea. He is fished out, but by that time his special birth and early treatment have already marked him as a special kind of person. He's raised by the gods, but he realizes at some point that he's stronger than they are, and he travels back to his mother's country. His family immediately rejects him, won't take him in, and he has to go through a whole series of trials and tribulations in order to win a place in that family, which he finally does and is finally accepted. His first great contribution to human life as a culture hero is a sort of unusual one. It's allowing birds to be seen by humans. Up until that time, they had only been heard, and humans thought that bird voices were the voices of gods. Maui, all his life, will have special relationships with birds, and now that people can see them, they turn out to be a source of great happiness for all human beings. Maui also pushes the sky away from the earth, giving people room to move around in. And we remember this, that separation of earth and sky, as one of the motifs from our first unit. He fishes up New Zealand from the bottom of the sea, and as soon as he does, people move onto it and live there. And so he makes another important contribution to South Pacific life. He slows down the sun in its daily course. Up until that time, the sun was going so fast across the sky that his mother didn't have time to make cloth during daylight. Crops didn't grow very well. People had no time even to cook their meals. Daylight was just a blink and it was over. What he does is he lassos the sun and he holds on to it until, like a cowboy, holds on to it until he gets it to slow down. And when he slows it down, he keeps slowing it down until it amounts to our day, the day that we have now. And so in another important way, he has created life as we still live it. Like Raven in North America or Prometheus in Greece, he steals fire. This time he gets it from the underworld, and he winds up giving it to humans. The story of his theft of fire is a very long and complicated one, and it's full of errors. He gets it wrong, and he gets fire almost back, and then he can't quite get it to human beings, and he has to do it over again. But at the end, he manages to pull off this major achievement of a major cultural hero by giving the gift of fire to human beings. The last bit of fire that he has, his last chance, he's run out of fire, he's just got this one little chance. One of his ancestors shows him how to store it in a tree, and later a bird shows him the trick of rubbing 2 sticks together to make new fires. As we said, he always has really interesting and close relationship with birds. At some point in one of his great adventures, he winds up stealing the wife of the great eel tuna, whose nickname is the penis. The great eel's wife is frustrated by her husband's lack of ardor. He's a cold creature, and she leaves him to go find a more aggressive male. She presents herself to many males, all of whom turn her down because they are frightened of her fearsome husband. Maui's mother, who is really grateful for all of the good things Maui has done for her and for people and for the family, says, go ahead, when she makes her offer to you, accept it, accept her advances. So he does, and they live happily together for a long while until that cold-blooded eel finally works up enough anger to go in search of his wife. And so he causes tidal waves as he comes ashore and causes great havoc and destruction. Everybody knows he's coming from a long ways away. And then when he finally meets with Maui, the two of them have a great, huge cosmic battle over this desirable female. The final part of this, there are a lot of chapters to this great contest that goes on between them. But in the final bout, each one agrees to enter into the body of the other one. The great eel enters Maui's body, and he just plans on staying there because he thinks, well, he'll get to enjoy his wife this way anyway. He'll just do it through the body of Maui. But Maui kicks him out. And then when it's Maui's turn to enter the eel's body, from the inside out, he tears the monster to pieces and kills him and emerges from the monster all at once. End of the great eel tuna. Next thing he does, another culture hero kind of thing, is he cuts off the monster's head and he plants it at the corner of his house, and there a green shoot soon appears. That green shoot grows into the world's first coconut tree. When it ripens, Maui shares the fruit with everyone in the village, and that's how the world came to have coconuts. This reminds us a little bit of the trickster in the Winnebago story, who discards the pieces of his penis that the chipmunk had chewed off, which grow into edible plants. And it's another sign that we are dealing here with a culture hero. Not all of Maui's contributions to human life are positive. His very last one introduces death into human life, or at least he fails to achieve immortality. In this story, he journeys to the underworld, and in the underworld, he has to encounter Hina of the Night, who's the goddess of the underworld and also his grandmother. The idea is that the test is that he has to enter her in some way, and if he emerges with her heart, he will have achieved immortality for all human beings. And so he goes down to make the effort. In some versions, he enters her mouth while she's sleeping, trying to get to her heart, which if he brings back, will give immortality to human beings. In others, he is supposed to enter through her vagina and tries to make his way to her heart from there. He cautions the birds, which are his constant companions, to be very silent while he's doing this, because she has to remain asleep while he's making this delicate effort. But one of the birds is so struck by the comic spectacle in front of him that the bird starts laughing uncontrollably. When the bird starts to laugh, Hina of the Night wakes up, and when she wakes up, she crushes Maui either with her teeth or with her insides, depending on which version of the story. That's the end of Maui, and that is also the end of the hope of immortality for human beings. All of this makes Maui a great culture hero. But he's also a trickster, too. The last two stories we've told suggest something of his trickster qualities. And there's another whole side to his character. In those sides, he breaks taboos all over the place. He commits incest with his mother, and one Tahitian account gives him incest with his sister. And then one of Maui's sons also has incest with his sister. In some versions, he has a long battle against his uncles, and he winds up slaughtering all of them. Killing your own uncles is very, very bad business. He corrects some flaws in the human body. It improves us a little bit so that we work a little better than we would have. He invents harpoons. He invents spears and fish traps and fish nets. But he never also stops playing tricks on authority figures, especially on the gods. His character throughout all of his tales is just richly ambiguous, even though his stories give him credit for much that makes human life easier. He's a perfect example of what makes a trickster such an interesting character. He's a weird and unexpected combination of taboo breaker on the one hand and culture hero on the other. And the combination isn't accidental. All cultures define themselves in ways that exclude some things and include others. What's excluded is always defined out of existence or thrown out into the trash as unacceptable, as unapproved, as forbidden. The trickster, as we've mentioned, always lives on those margins, lives on those walls that divide the acceptable from the unacceptable. He moves back and forth between the two, carrying material back and forth, and that material modifies both of them in the process. The trickster, as we said, does what he does not because he's malicious or because he's altruistic, but because he does what he does. That's what's in character for him to do. That's just the way he is. His power comes in part from the result of not being constrained by the rules or conventions that bind the rest of us. Most of us, myself included, and most of you who are listening to or hearing or watching these lectures are people who live inside the walls of our culture. And we believe in standards and rules and ethical norms. For us, the trickster is always grinning at us from the other side of the wall. He's holding in his hand or paw dirt or garbage that he's always ready to throw or bring into our safe world. We can, if we choose, tie him up and bury him under the earth, but we have the Norse myth of Loki and Asgard and Ragnarok to remind us of what happens when we do this. Once we eliminate the trickster from our world, we've just made ourselves so pure and rigid that we probably can't survive. Maui does a lot of things that no one else in his culture would approve of, but he brings so many gifts in the process that we put up with the pains in order to receive the benefits. And we tell his stories to our children because the trickster isn't really a malicious character. But, as we noted last time, he's part Don Quixote, he's part Falstaff, he's part Charlie Chaplin, he's part Toad of Toad Hall, an endearing character who does what he does because of who he is. In a way, then, the Norse myth is that we've looked at in this lecture is our negative example. And the other three are more positive examples. The Greek gods took Hermes into their pantheon, and although he changed it, it was richer for his membership. Enki was welcomed back into his pantheon because while things had changed because of what he had done, the Sumerians recognized that this kind of change, even if unwanted, is mostly good for us. In this case, it had saved the human race. And the Hawaiians revered Maui for what he had done to make our lives better, despite the fact that in the process, he had broken every taboo important to the people. Change always hurts, and when we're wedded to keeping things as they are, as Frigg discovers, Frigg does work so hard to try to keep things from changing. But keeping things as they are can as easily lead to death as to perfection, or maybe lead to death because we've achieved a perfection which is in some ways inhuman. The trickster is always there, either on the wall or just on the other side of the wall to remind us of this. That's a look at 4 tricksters from around the world. Next time we're going to take a look at some Native American tricksters. And these will have names that sound familiar to us, but we need not to confuse them with the characters that we know. We're going to look at a trickster called Spider-Man, but not to be confused with the comic book or movie hero. We're going to look at a character called Raven, who shouldn't be confused with Heckle and Jekyll, comic books that I read when I was a child. And we're going to look at a character named Coyote, who's not to be confused with the Warner Brothers character who never catches the Roadrunner. These are some of the great tricksters of Native American myths, and those we'll take a look at in our next lecture.